I never knew a single name could silence an entire family gathering until that afternoon. Dennis Holloway was leaning back in his patio chair, beer swaying in his hand, savoring the laughter around him the way he'd been doing for decades. He waited for everyone to look at him. Then he looked at me, wearing the familiar smile of a man who knows he's winning. Let me guess. Loud enough for the whole yard to hear. The army must have given you one hell of a nickname. Something like, Little Princess? Laughter rippled through the crowd. A kid knocked over a paper plate. Someone cracked open another beer. A perfectly ordinary family afternoon. Then I answered. One word. Barely above a whisper. Almost to myself. And across the yard, Frank Dooley, the silver-haired man who had been standing quietly by the fence all afternoon, carrying himself the way people do when they've survived things they'll never speak of, set his glass down. Not casually. With both hands. Slowly. Deliberately. As though he needed to make sure his hands were empty before facing whatever was coming next. Then he looked straight at me. I had seen many kinds of eyes in my life. Eyes filled with fear. Eyes hollow with pain. Eyes fighting not to break in the middle of a battlefield. But Frank Dooley's eyes in that moment were something I had only seen once before. The eyes of a man who has just heard the name of someone he was certain the world had already swallowed whole. The yard went silent. Dennis Holloway was still smiling. He hadn't understood yet what had just happened. Hadn't understood that his joke had just unearthed something I had spent 20 years burying deep, carefully. Certain I would never have to look at it again. My name is Margaret Holloway. People who knew me in another life call me Mag. I'm 55 years old. And for 20 of those years I worked very hard to be the kind of woman nobody thought about twice. The quiet cousin who showed up occasionally, stayed near the edge of things, and left before dark. The one the family described as she was in the army emphasis on was as though military service was something you grew out of, like a phase. I never corrected them. It was easier that way. Then my Aunt Beverly turned 78 and called me personally. Mag, she said. In that voice she's had my whole life warm and a little worn, like a quilt that has been through too many winters. I'd really love to see you, so I drove 3 hours from Bern to Kerrville with Peach Cobbler in the back seat, telling myself I would be polite, stay quiet, and leave before dark. Dennis Holloway had other plans. My cousin has always been the kind of man who mistakes volume for confidence. He sells commercial real estate in San Antonio and treats every family gathering like a deal he needs to close. He had already been working through a cooler of imported beer by the time I pulled into the driveway, and he greeted me with the particular enthusiasm of a man who has spotted a new audience. The mystery woman returns, he announced across the yard. A few cousins laughed. I went to find Aunt Beverly. The afternoon moved the way. Hill country summer afternoons do slow and golden. Kids chasing each other through the live oaks, someone arguing about the Rangers, the brisket excellent, and everything else predictable. I stayed near the edge of things, which is where I am most comfortable. Around 4 o'clock, a black pickup rolled in. Out stepped an older man, lean, white-haired, military cut, khakis despite the heat. Even before Aunt Beverly introduced him, I recognized the way he held himself. Combat veterans carry their bodies differently. It doesn't leave with age. It just gets quieter. His name was Frank Dooley. He had served alongside Beverly's late husband years ago. We shook hands. I looked away first. I should have known, right then, that the day had already changed. By early evening, Dennis had gathered a small audience near the cooler and was in full performance mode. I was sitting by the railing watching the hill country light go gold over the cedar brush when he wandered over, beer in hand, with the swagger of a man who has decided he needs new material. So, loud enough for half the porch. Did you actually do anything dangerous? Or was it mostly paperwork? A few cousins chuckled. I shrugged. Sometimes. Sometimes what? Sometimes dangerous. Sometimes paperwork. More laughter. Dennis grinned wider. He was warming up. I could feel Frank watching from across the patio. I should have shut it down. Instead, maybe because I was tired, or maybe because 20 years of making myself small had simply worn through, I answered honestly. Mostly I flew. Hand to hand when it got bad. Knives occasionally. Dennis stared at me, then burst out laughing. Right. Sure. He glanced around at the cousins. Okay, so what was the call sign? Big tough army nickname? He was performing. The porch was his stage. I was supposed to be the prop. I looked at him for one moment. Then I said it. Chadon. Frank Dooley set his drink down. The way you set something down when you need your hands free for what comes next? He crossed the patio in a few steps. His voice was low enough that only the nearest people could hear. Kunar Province, he said. October 2004. I didn't answer. 160th sore. Still nothing. Frank's jaw tightened. His eyes glistened slightly. Then, in front of my aunt, my cousins, Dennis Holloway with his half-finished beer, Frank Dooley, straightened his back and raised his right hand to his temple and held it. Nobody moved. Dennis's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I want to be honest with you here, because I think you deserve it. Moments like this never feel the way you might imagine they would. There is no warmth in being seen after years of choosing not to be. Mostly it feels like walls coming down faster than you're ready for. In a room full of people you're not entirely sure you trust with what's on the other side. Dennis cleared his throat. Okay, somebody tell me what's happening. Frank pulled out a chair and sat directly across from me. You really disappeared, he said quietly. I meant to. He gave a short, tired exhale. People talked about you like a ghost story. Dennis folded his arms. Talked about her? Why? Frank finally looked at him. You know what a call sign is? Sure. Most are dumb. A nickname. An inside joke. He nodded toward me. Not that one. Dennis frowned. You're serious. There were rangers. Green berets. Medics. Pilots. Men alive today because of decisions she made when every other option was already off the table. The porch had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the stunned silence of the salute. Something slower and heavier, the sound of people mentally reassembling something they thought they'd already understood. Dennis tried to recover. I mean, you're making her sound like some kind of action hero. Frank's expression didn't change. Action heroes, he said quietly, are fiction. That shut Dennis up. Aunt Beverly sat down and touched my arm. Mag, sweetheart. What did you do? I looked at my hands for a moment. Old hands. Scarred at the knuckles. A crooked finger from a fracture that healed wrong because there wasn't a surgeon available when it needed setting. Hands that carry their own memory. I flew medevac support, I said. Frank corrected me immediately. Black zone extraction. The missions that don't exist on paper. I closed my eyes briefly. Most civilians have no real picture of what combat helicopter pilots do in active war zones. They imagine the movies clean and dramatic, heroic and loud. Real war is almost nothing like that. Real war is exhaustion in your bones, rotor vibration that never fully leaves your body, and the specific quality of fear that comes from knowing you are the only moving thing between someone still alive and something that doesn't want them to stay that way. Frank leaned back. Kunar Province, he said again, this time for the whole porch. October 2004. There was a recon team trapped after an ambush. A sandstorm rolling in fast. Visibility collapsing. Enemy fighters already repositioning. He paused. Command ordered all air units to withdraw. Aunt Beverly's hand tightened on my arm. One pilot didn't withdraw, Frank said. I stared at my untouched sweet tea. That wasn't courage, I said. It was stubbornness. No, Frank said. It was the right thing. Honestly, I want to pause here for a second. Because this is one of those moments in a story where most people would expect a warm feeling to arrive. The recognition. The vindication. The sense of being finally seen. But I've learned that being seen after years of deliberate invisibility doesn't feel warm. It feels like exposure. Like someone has just opened a door you spent a long time nailing shut. And all you can do is sit there while the air changes. Dennis was leaning forward now. Performance gone. So she flew in anyway. Blind, Frank said. No visibility. Taking fire from 2 positions. The helicopter was already hit before she reached the extraction point. He looked at me. You were on fire when you landed. Aunt Beverly made a soft sound. I kept my voice even. The team was already carrying their wounded when I sat down. One man missing part of his hand. Another with a chest wound that had no business leaving him conscious. We loaded everyone and lifted. I paused. Then another rocket hit. I stopped myself before describing the smell. Some things belong only to the people who were there. We got out, I said. With a lot of luck. And the best co-pilot I ever flew with. Frank's face tightened slightly. Martinez. Yeah. Some silences inside a story are about someone who isn't in the story anymore. Everyone at the table understood that one without being told. Then Dennis said it. Quietly. No performance left. If all this is true, why didn't you ever say anything? To us? To anyone? That answer had been ready for 20 years. Because I chose not to, I said. And then because someone else made the choice for me. Here is what actually happened after Kunar. Not the official version. The true one. The commanding officer overseeing the operation, Colonel Raymond Stokes, ordered the withdrawal before the ground team was secured. He panicked. Not tactically. Not strategically. He panicked the way any human being panics when the situation stops resembling the plan, and he pulled everyone back to protect his record. When I flew back in anyway and the story started moving through channels, someone needed to absorb the consequences of the operation not going cleanly. I was available. I had ignored a direct order. The paperwork did the rest. Charged with reckless conduct, endangerment of military assets, compromised judgment under duress, thorough, convincing, almost entirely fabricated. Dennis was quiet for a long time. They punished you for going back in. They punished me, I said, for making Stokes look like what he was. Frank's jaw was tight. I tried to fight it. Others tried. I know. It went nowhere. He looked at me with the specific anger that only exists in people who have watched a wrong thing persist for a very long time. The brass closed ranks. If you have ever watched an institution protect itself at someone else's expense, watch the language of leadership and duty get used to cover cowardice, you know the particular nausea of that. It doesn't look like evil. It looks like paperwork. It looks like procedure. It looks like reasonable people making difficult decisions. That is what makes it so hard to fight, and so hard to forget. I lost my commission. My marriage ended 2 years later. He said, honestly, that the war had gotten more of me than he ever had. He wasn't wrong. I moved to Bourne. I grew vegetables and kept to myself and told myself that invisibility was a choice I had made rather than a thing that had been done to me. Most of the time I almost believed it. Why are you telling us this now? Dennis asked. Genuinely. No edge left in it. I'm not, I said. Frank started it. That got a small laugh. Something in the air loosened slightly. Then Frank spoke again, and it tightened right back. Stokes is in San Antonio tomorrow night, he said. Guest speaker at the Hill Country Veterans Gala. Very honored. Very comfortable. My entire chest did something it hadn't done in years. He's a retired general now, Frank said. Well regarded. Has been for decades. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear. At 55, fear changes its shape. When you're young, you fear failure and bullets and embarrassment. When you're older, you fear memories. I sat on my back porch outside Bourne listening to the cicadas and the cedar and the specific sound of Texas darkness, while old sounds came back uninvited. Rotor vibration, radio static cutting in and out. A man's voice on the other end of a frequency praying, because he had stopped believing anyone was coming. Frank called at 10 the next morning. You going? No. You should. I spent 20 years avoiding men like Stokes. He was quiet for a moment. Mag, he said carefully, sometimes the thing you've been avoiding isn't pain. It's the end of it. I hated when old veterans got philosophical before noon, but I was dressed by 6. The Riverwalk venue was packed. Dress uniforms, American flags at the entrance, the kind of room that knows how to honor sacrifice in ways that are comfortable for everyone. Raymond Stokes was already near the stage, tall, silver-haired, the ease of a man who has spent decades having rooms respond to him exactly as he expected. He saw me the moment I walked in, not gradually, immediately. And the recognition was followed just as quickly by something faster and smaller that he couldn't entirely hide. Fear. Brief. Real. He came to us eventually because a man like Stokes does not allow himself to look like he is avoiding anything. Margaret Holloway, he said, controlled, smooth. It's been a long time. 20 years, I said, give or take. His eyes scanned me carefully. You look well. You look comfortable. Frank coughed into his hand. Stokes's polished expression didn't crack, but it thinned. This isn't the place. You made sure of that, I said. 20 years ago. I want to slow down what happened next. Because this is the part that still lives in my body, not just my memory. This is the part I want you to feel. Stokes spoke beautifully. He always did. The vocabulary of men who have made their peace with the distance between the words they use and the things they actually did. Duty, honor, sacrifice. The crowd responded warmly. Older Americans know this language. They were raised inside it. And Stokes delivered it with exactly the right gravity, exactly the right pause in exactly the right places. Then his eyes found me at the back table. And something shifted. He began talking about veterans who struggle to reintegrate, trauma affecting judgment, memory distortion. He used careful clinical language, sympathetic on the surface, pointed underneath. He was building a frame, right there at the podium. The same thing he had done 20 years ago, using polished language to bury a truth, while a room full of people nodded respectfully. Frank's hand went flat on the table. Then Stokes said something about former personnel who construct narratives around themselves afterward. And he smiled. Small. Sad. The smile of a man offering pity as a weapon. Frank stood up. Not dramatically, just stood. But in that room, at that moment, the sound it made was everything. I was there. His old voice carried farther than it should have. The room went absolutely still. Kunar Province. October 2004. I was on the ground when that helicopter came in. Stokes's expression changed instantly. Frank, no. Frank's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. You've had 20 years to tell this story your way. He pointed toward me. She's been silent for 20 years to survive it. That ends tonight. The ballroom held its breath. Then a man near the front slowly pushed himself up from a wheelchair, older, gray beard, missing his right leg below the knee. He turned toward me, and his face had a quality. I recognized not pity, not admiration, but the specific expression of someone who has been carrying gratitude for so long it has started to feel like grief. She brought me home, he said, into the silence, simply. Then another man stood, a former medic, then a woman in her 60s holding a folded military cap. Her voice was shaking. My son talked about her before he died. Then a former ranger. Then an elderly man, hands trembling, who said nothing at all. He just stood, and the standing was enough. Unbe1. I sat completely still. I could feel my hands on the tablecloth. I could feel the specific quality of air in a room when truth that has been compressed for 20 years is finally given room to expand. Stokes had stopped speaking. He stood at the podium looking like a man who had finally run out of altitude. All the polish, all the posture, all the decorated certainty just gone. Frank looked up at him and said, clearly, so the entire room could hear. The Kunar operational files were partially declassified last year. Anyone here can read them. His voice shook slightly with the weight of 20 years of anger. You abandoned your people, and then you spent 2 decades calling it leadership. Nobody applauded. Nobody moved. The ballroom had become something else entirely. Then the man in the wheelchair raised a trembling hand to his forehead and held it there, perfectly still. And I realized, sitting in that room with 300 people watching, that after 20 years I no longer wanted revenge. I had stopped wanting it somewhere in the last hour without noticing. What I wanted, what I had always actually wanted, was simply for the wrong story to stop being the one that got to stand. Stokes called me 3 days later. We met at a small place outside Bern. Just coffee. He looked terrible, not physically, but in the way that people look when they've stopped being able to perform the version of themselves they've maintained for decades. He stared at his cup for a long time. I was afraid, he said finally. When the storm hit and communications went down, I panicked. I told myself withdrawing was tactical. For years I told myself that. He swallowed. But it wasn't. I was terrified and I ran, and then I needed someone else to absorb the consequence. He looked up at me. I hated you, he said quietly. Every time your name came up, for years. He looked at his hands. Because every time someone mentioned Charon, I remembered exactly what I actually was. The diner was ordinary around us. Older couples, country music low, coffee being refilled, the world continuing entirely indifferent to two people sitting across from each other, with 20 years of damage between them. "Why didn't you come after me sooner?" he asked. "You could have." I looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because hatred gets heavy," I said. "You carry it long enough and eventually it starts carrying you." He didn't respond. He just nodded, slowly, like a man who has finally been told something he already knew. I didn't offer forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't a transaction. The lost years were still real. The marriage, the panic attacks, the isolation. None of that disappeared, because he finally said the true thing. But something in me had already shifted before this conversation began. Something had been set down. 2 weeks later, Frank invited me to a veteran support circle in comfort small room. Folding chairs, coffee and paper cups. Young soldiers recently back. Some Vietnam vets. A man who barely spoke all evening. I recognized that silence immediately. Trauma has a sound, and sometimes the sound is nothing at all. I almost didn't speak. I have spent so many years protecting the interior of things that sharing it out loud still feels like removing armor in public. But there was a young veteran near the wall staring at the floor with the exact expression I used to wear after Afghanistan. And that expression changed my mind. "People hear military stories," I said, "and they think the hardest part is combat." A few people nodded. "For most of us, the hardest part is afterward. Coming home and being expected to resume a life that has no category for what you've seen. War changes the speed of your thinking, changes how safe anything ever feels, and most people don't have language for that, so they leave you alone with it." The young veteran near the wall looked up. "I spent years believing isolation was strength," I said. "That if I stayed quiet and invisible, nothing could reach me. But loneliness is patient. It starts to feel normal. And one day you realize you've built your whole life around avoiding pain instead of choosing anything." Near the end of the evening, the young veteran found me by the coffee table. He looked like someone who had been holding a question for a long time. "You really think people come back from the dark part?" he asked. "From what?" He shrugged helplessly. "The darkness." I thought about it honestly. "Not completely," I said, "but enough to live again. And there's a difference between those two things that matters more than people tell you." His eyes were wet. He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Driving home through the hill country that evening, windows down, warm cedar smell of Texas in the dark, Lou already asleep in the back seat, I sat, with something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter and more durable. The feeling of having finally stopped running in the same direction as where I needed to go. Here is what I have come to understand. After 55 years and 20 of them spent trying to disappear, the strongest thing I ever did was not the mission. The decisions made in those seconds were made in terror, without time for reflection. The strongest thing I ever did was choosing slowly, deliberately, long after the war was over, to stop protecting everyone, including myself, from the truth of what had happened. The silence I built around it was not strength. It was a habit I had mistaken for one. If you are carrying something like this, not a war necessarily, but something that happened to you that got renamed by the person who caused it, I want to ask you something. Not about this story. About the silence you built around your own. The one that started as protection, and somewhere along the way became a room you live in. Is there someone who needs to hear the true version of what happened? Not for revenge. Not for justice. Simply so, the wrong story stops being the one that gets to stand. That question sat with me for a long time before I was ready for it. I think it might sit with you too. And sitting with it, honestly, is already something. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Tell me what time it is there. If something moved in you, if you recognize something in this story that belongs to you, leave a comment. One line is enough. And if you know someone carrying this kind of invisible weight, send this to them without any explanation. They'll understand why. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you need it. I'll be here. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in San Antonio, Texas to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental.